We are doing another book review. It's on company-wide agility with Beyond Budgeting, Open Space, and Sociocracy by Jutta Eckstein and John Buck. And today we have author John Buck on the meetup, and he's going to talk with us some about the background, and we can dig into chapters and contents and have a good discussion. John, would you like to give a little bit of background on where things came?
Yeah, the book started at an Agile conference, I think 2016 or 17, I'm not sure which. Jutta Eckstein, and who's like a really super duper Agile coach, really active in Agile for a long time. And I decided that we wanted to do a joint presentation about how you could combine Agile and sociocracy. And the quick question, how many people even know much about sociocracy in the group?
We were experimenting or looking into holocracies. Sociocracy was kind of new for me.
Brian Robertson was a client of mine one time, and he made his own variation of it. The idea of sociocracy and to some degree holocracy is that you typically, when you're trying to get things done in any general organization, they're going to have some kind of need to have some top-down direction. And there's no reverse up direction. And so these two methods try to use some cybernetics and primarily the work of Gerard Endenburg, who's a really brilliant electronics engineer in Holland that has been running a company as an experiment, a live company as a management experiment. And he took a lot of the training he'd had in cybernetics and said, okay, if you just have a power system that's going down, you don't have a feedback loop. I'd never make an electronic circuit that way. So the sociocracy is all about rewiring power, and you end up with an organization that both has a hierarchy and doesn't. It flips back and forth between them. And there's all kinds of good stuff that comes out of that and some challenges that come out of it. But in any case, there's a lot of overlap between cybernetics and Agile and cybernetics and sociocracy. So Jutta and I were talking about that. And when we met for coffee afterwards, we looked at each other and said, nope, we haven't nailed it yet. There's more to it. And so we said, all right, let's write a book together, kind of just like that. And so our question was, how do you get all these great things that come out of the Agile methodology and make them go company-wide? And they weren't designed to go company-wide. Like, one of the lines in the manifesto says, like, working software over documentation. But if you're applying it to a restaurant, you can't go in and tell the chef to worry about working software. That's not his job. So we could see that it needed to be expanded. And we started looking around for other methodologies that were kind of pushing at the same thing, that were actually being used by companies live to run their companies. And we whittled it down, and we came out with Beyond Budgeting, which is a really interesting approach to budgeting that was developed in the Scandinavian countries. And of course, then there's the open space that, and we're more worried about organizational open space than conference open space, the sort of thing that they do like at, say, Gore-Tex, where anybody that feels moved to start a new project, you just go ahead and start a new project. It's self-organizing that way. So we combined them all, and one day we noticed that if we made an acronym out of it, that we could do BOSSA, Beyond Budgeting, Open Space, Sociocracy, and Agile. So we said, what the hell, let's call it Bossa Nova. And so we combined all these, and we generalized the principles in the manifesto. And then we said, well, now what? We got to part 3, and we thought for a while, and we said, well, what you do with all this theory excuse me, I'm kind of stuffed up tonight. What you do with all this theory is that you use it to come up with good hypotheses for experiments, for probes that you do. And we're all dealing with the VUCA world. So the only way you deal with VUCA is by doing experiments, by probing it to see what kind of sense you can make of it. So we said, okay, let's go. And we started using the theory to make predictive hypotheses, to give demonstrations as to what it meant to do that. And in fact, we find that a lot of our training is just on that. How do you actually do a sensible probe? And there's lots of interesting things that come out of that. Like one of the examples we give in the book is the question of, is trust cheaper? And the hypothesis was that if they got rid of all the rules around doing expense sheets when you go on travel, that it would be actually cheaper. People would actually spend less if they were trusted, which it turns out some companies have done, and it's true. So they did experiments and tried it, and then there it went. We found when we wrote that there were a lot of different companies using pieces of the Bossa Nova. And we did finally find one that on its own had come up with all four, and that's Titansoft. It's a software company that's headquartered in Singapore and Taiwan. And they have, their slogan is, we're always developing. And they had just on their own gone through and incorporated all four things. So they're going, yay, somebody does, and the book's now translated into Chinese. So that's a fast run through on the whole thing. We got wading into some deep stuff in parts of the book, but it was a neat experience writing it, because we used the extreme programming idea of one keyboard, two programmers. We had 20 fingers and one document, and it was a lot of fun writing. We only wrote when we were together online.
That's awesome. I guess maybe I'll just jump into some of the questions that I had, and then other people can jump in if they've. And I appreciate you guys doing an audio as well for the book. But I've actually written budgeting software before, and some actually somewhat complex budgeting software for government, which has a lot more complexity because of appropriations based off of
Right.
legislation and stuff like that. And I was just fascinated, that part of the book, you know, because the budget is really where the rubber meets the road for an organization. So people can talk all day about strategy and whatever, but then, you know, how is it that you deal with where the money goes?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, have you guys, you know, written, or do you know of software that's specific to the beyond budgeting component?
No, that's interesting. I have not seen any advertised per se. One of the companies that this was developed in is Statoil, which is a Norwegian oil company. It's now called Equinor, and they're trying to get out of the oil business into the alternative energy business. But in any case, their position basically is just that if you have an annual budget, you're not agile.
Yeah.
Like, look at what happened with the virus. You put a lot of money or a lot of effort into coming up with your annual budget, and now what? It's, you know, out the window. And so that's an example of annual budgets being unable to deal with VUCA. I know that I've run across some people who said that their companies adopted beyond budgeting, and they said it was great. If they had a project to do, the first meeting they'd have, there'd be somebody from the budget people there understanding what they were doing and saying, okay, we'll do this and that to try to get you money, and we'll feed it to you as you need it. And none of this, you know, wait for 6 months after you put in your budget request and it gets approved, and you play games like, oh my God, it's the end of the fiscal year and we haven't spent all our money, let's spend it fast so they don't cut us, and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so they separate target from forecast from allocation. Those are three separate things that need to be handled separately. And unfortunately, I can't, that's a really good question. I'm writing it down here to ask. I don't know of specific software. I'll find out. And Brandon, if there's any way, I'll send you the answer to that.
Yeah, there's a whole movement about participatory budgeting and the softwares in infancy, but I'd be interested in knowing about that. Also, Inspiral has some budgeting software, but it's really kind of based off of kind of a proposal about a budget, and it's kind of, I haven't worked on the insane style of budgeting software.
Beyond budgeting is,
yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Beyond budgeting goes into things outside of budgeting also, like they get into personnel policy a lot. Like, talking about relative targets, which kind of goes along with the same budgeting thing. But if you're a salesperson and you're supposed to sell 100 units and the virus hits and all your competitors only sold 10, then you're doing great. But if it's normal times and you sold 100 and your competitors all sold 400, it's not worth anything. So they're very much into people writing their own performance reviews and really being very agile about performance reviews.
Yeah.
But the key is that you got to separate these three facets of budgets. If it doesn't do that, then it's going to get all mixed up and people start playing games with it.
Yeah, I don't want to take over because I will totally pick your brain about budgeting and we'll just turn it into that. But does anyone else have anything that jumped out at them about the book? Counterintuitive truths type things, anything like that? Come on, guys.
I was getting interesting in the budgeting talk, but
good.
Well, what seems to come back specifically for us, Volk, would be a lot of the distributed decision-making related things. Some of the stuff about open space tied in with that, and then the sociocracy as well. But we're a cooperative, and the owners have it's a one member, one owner vote. And then we try to run with all the associates where we're trying to get buy-in. We want the stuff about consent for decision making and how to do that, and trying to get people to collaborate in based on interest, and then maybe the parts tying in with, well, what about stuff that you need to get done that people may not want to do, and how do you make that happen? And there was different parts that address that, but trying to fit all that together, I guess, is where I'm interested. So I have a lot of experience with freelance collectives where you're hoping people will do the work, and then open source projects, often you have people where you're putting it out there, you're not paying them, and you're hoping people will participate and contribute. So as a cooperative, we have a lot of that, a software cooperative specifically, we have a lot of what you'd see in the open source. We're also a distributed company with people all around the world, and we want people to have autonomy and interests and have buy-in. So I guess a lot of the distributed decision-making, and then accountability to, accountability to the end users would be the interesting parts for me. Who are your end users? So flipping some of the discussions about that. I know that covers a lot, but.
Answer all of it for us,
yeah.
please.
Let me answer it. Let me answer it somewhat indirectly to begin with. There's a structural problem with co-ops. I'm part of a couple of co-ops that are actually legally LLCs, but we have the operating agreements written to take care of the all the goals of a co-op. But structurally, co-op has some big problems in that it's owned. The control comes from ownership, and you want an organization that owns itself, just like you own yourself, not owned like it was a slave. And so when you have the situation also where you have owners, and the owners are at the top of the organization and also the workers, you have a situation like you do with if you have a closed system in physics. The second law of thermodynamics takes over, and the energy deteriorates, the energy goes down. Any closed system is that way, and a co-op by its very nature is a closed system. It's got nobody from the outside because your owners are all inside, controls all inside, and it makes what happens is you end up with a lot of squabbling. Squabbling is the sign of a social system deteriorating. And so the design is bad. So just with that aside, then you've got the need to have an overview, and have the overview be top down, operating in accordance with the rules set bottom up. So if you're trying to get people to do things, there's nothing better than a boss to get them done. But let's elect your boss. Let's not have the boss imposed by owners. So if you have that, and if you have the containers or the structures or the tradition, however you want to say it, of having time to reflect, like this meeting is great. This meeting is what I might even call a reflexive inquiry, thinking about how we're thinking. And that's if you read the complexity theorists like Stacy, that's where creative ideas come from. So it's just fantastic. But the co-op itself ought to be making time to do that. So if you have a system where you don't make time for that, and you don't have the structures to do that, then you're going to run into trouble and not be always growing, continuous learning. If you want to see the way we have the rules written in these LLC co-ops, I'm happy to share them. But a lot of these questions go away if you say, okay, we need to get things done. We're going to assign somebody to make us get them done, only we're going to set the rules for that. So we're our own legislature setting the rules for the leader. Then a lot of those problems go away. You get the commitment, you get the people really trying hard, you get the trust that comes from orderliness, and you don't keep worrying about, oh, are we all equal with each other, because you are and you're not. And you flip back and forth between that, and that gets things done.
I heard a couple things in what you're saying. I heard you say you should elect the boss.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
okay, yeah. So, and you're saying that there are problems with the co-op because you don't elect the boss?
Well, the boss
Or,
is the owners,
right. But,
okay? So they don't get elected.
oh, so like I saw in the book, so bringing it back to the book, you guys were researching Mondragon, and said, and decided against it because it doesn't really facilitate venture capital. Within Mondragon, it's basically run, you have a republic, they elect their bosses.
Yeah.
So,
But Mondragon has come a long ways. There are a number of organizations like, what is it, Gore-Tex I mentioned, Northern Star. I'm drawing a blank on the company down in Brazil. The Mondragon has come a long ways, but and Mondragon has done a good job of actually starting to train people around the world about what their methods are. So in general, though, we didn't include companies that were just doing things themselves and not trying to turn it into a highly adoptable methodology by anybody. I'm on the fence about Mondragon. It's a while since I've looked at him. We know that we didn't get everybody in the book, but when I looked at Mondragon a long time ago, I said no, they don't have it that yet. They still are top down, and like a year later, they had the first labor strike. And so I said, okay, I called that one right, but that was quite some time ago. And so I haven't looked at them closely lately. I don't know how they go about electing the top control.
Yeah, it's just basically democracy. But so here's a hard question, I guess. How would you define exploitation?
Ha! Exploitation. Well, if you're in a system that's unfair, if it's impartial, well, if it's fair, impartial, tolerant, and just, it's not going to be exploitative. If it starts to not be any of those, then it's going to start getting exploitative. So
Sounds pretty good. Yeah.
I'm all in favor of fairness, impartiality, tolerance, and justness.
Yeah. So I noticed in the book there's I'm kind of sensitive to different terms and words that people use when people use words about equality, and then they use a word like egalitarianism and things like that, trying to figure out what they mean by that. And then it's interesting to try to tease out what people mean by fairness. Right. So exploitation, and if you're familiar with Richard Wolff, the economist, it's really kind of the expert on cooperatives, or the most popular person about cooperatives right now. Their definition of exploitation kind of just, you can kind of simplify it and say, if you don't get a vote on the surplus, which is what people normally would call the profit, but to simplify it or to explain it to everybody, if you make widgets and you work on the widget and the cost to make the widget is $6, and then the widget gets sold for $10, that $4 is the surplus. If you do not get a vote on what to do with that surplus, that $4, then that's exploitation. That's the definition of exploitation. Yeah. There's different definitions of exploitation, so not to get into something crazy, but that would be where I would say the rubber meets the road.
Right.
And so when we're talking about fairness and trying to tease out what is fairness and what for labor and so on and so forth, that definition I've found is kind of where you can kind of draw a line in the sand and say, okay, well, you can just do whatever you want. If you don't, you can have all kinds of things that allow for people to feel good for a while, if you deny that definition. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I'd say that the bottom-up control is totally fundamental. You should be able to not consent to whatever your organization is doing around money. And that's one of the things that sociocracy does really well, is if you don't like it, then you holler. Another facet of it is that it is complex, as you say. And so I like the organizations that I think we mentioned them in the book, that do things like saying, okay, we got a bonus coming, guys. We're going to get together and figure out who gets it. How are we going to divide it up? And you got all kinds of things that'll come out of that process, and everybody has to consent to it. I draw a distinction sometimes between equality and equivalence. Equality, if you're getting into mathematics, means it's identical. And in a democratic election, everybody's equal because each ballot is identical to the next one. That's different than equivalence, which says everybody's different, but the value is the same. So if you're doing a consent decision, your voice is going to have different things to say than everybody else's, but your voice needs to be included, and you guarantee it with the consent. Yeah, you get lots of really great thinking when you're trying to say, I think this, you think that. How do we do both? Which is what you get into with consent. There are schemes that Endenburg came up with that try to balance the interests of investors and the interests of the workers and puts them all on the same level, and is a interesting formula so that you're comparing apples and apples. And maybe that's fair, maybe it's not. There's some companies that have tried it that said, we're going to get the equality in different ways. Nobody understands this. So it's some do and some don't. The key thing is that everybody's got to be able to get in there and say, okay, I can accept this.
One of the things I latched on to within the book was the part where where you all decided to exclude cooperatives because you said that you can't involve, or it's difficult to involve venture capital. And
in the pure co-op structure that a lot of the laws require, that's true.
Yeah. So I appreciate that, that this is a model where you can, and then some of the things that you said earlier makes it added on to that, where you have some type of system where you want to, if you have a closed system, if I remember what you're saying, if you have a closed system, it's kind of this little feedback loop that's only inside the system.
Yeah.
If you want to be able to absorb external shocks, you need to be able to get information from external sources. So venture capitalists saying, hey, we don't like what you're doing, would be an external source of information, that kind of thing. So that definitely is something that I think needs to be addressed or talked about more within cooperatives. So as far as I can see, basically cooperatives, it's like, okay, well, you're gonna have to get a loan from people and that's it.
Right.
There isn't really a way for someone to say, I want to own something and I'm not participating, but I want to own, here's some money, but you got to give me, here's some money, but I'm not participating.
Yeah.
And that is it just doesn't facilitate that model at all.
Right. There's legal tricks. The easiest thing, like I say, is to do an LLC and write your own operating agreement the way you want.
It sounds like the main issue that you were having with cooperatives is legal structures that have been created versus maybe, say, the principles behind them.
I think the principles are great. That's why I say we've got an LLC that establishes, uses the principles. But I don't know, it may be that in the history of co-ops, I think they started with John Stuart Mills back in the late 1800s. And I think that somebody in there kind of got scared of them and decided to put some laws on them that hamstring them, is my guess. I don't know it for sure.
Well, there are actual legal entities, but they're more on the local side for cooperatives. Like there's one in Texas. There's an actual legal entity for cooperatives. It's just not federal yet, or if it ever will be. There's also strong laws for cooperatives in Italy.
Oh, interesting.
Just basically what's incentivized by the federal side and what's not. But so there's a legal side and there's barriers there. Mm-hmm. And then there's the principles. But principle wise, if you're saying one worker, one vote, and then if you're talking about capital, which essentially is I'm giving you money, but I'm not working, then that's a fundamental issue as far as getting resources. So that's where I think that's a big part of what I took away from the book, the first part of the book, is addressing that. If you can't do that, well, how can you try to do some type of self-organizing to facilitate external. And that, as far right now, that's where if someone were to say, how can you facilitate external investment and try to do self-organizing, then right now this book is where I would say, okay, well, these people here have a way that they said to do it.
And the way to do that is to set up a situation where that venture capitalist has consent and everybody else has consent, so that the money's not the boss. You don't have the the golden rule. He has the gold makes the rules.
Right.
But it may be that you need that voice of that venture capitalist. You may need, like, depending upon the work you're doing, you might need the voice of somebody who knows the environment.
Mm-hmm.
You might need somebody who knows the laws real well, or the social milieu that you're dealing with. And if you can get those voices in, and with consent, saying, look out, if you do this, this is what's going to happen, and it's an area or a specialty that you don't have, then you're much stronger.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I noticed, if someone else jump in if they have some questions, one of the things I noticed, the part where trying to deal with the law, the legal side of, if someone's the owner, they get to elect the board of directors, all that stuff like that. Trying to deal with that, trying to facilitate that, trying to deal with making some type of semblance of self-organization, right? And you guys had I think it was called a committee board, or committee of one, or something like that, where it was an extra, the board can elect to have another group that is really going to be right. It's really going to be the workers.
That's a trick. You
Right.
know who invented that trick?
Mm-hmm.
It was Benjamin
Who?
Franklin.
Nice. All right.
He was a clever dude.
Yeah. I like Benjamin Franklin with the juntas and everything. He as far as doing that and legally doing that, it seems like there's this phase of the entity where maybe if you put it in the bylaws or something like that, where you say, okay, we're going to have investors, fine, but there will be this other board, and they'll have some kind of way of making definitive decisions. Like their votes will be pulled in, and by law, within the bylaws. It seems like something like that can make it to where it's not just essentially a ploy. And this is something that I'm sensitive to. You guys used a example of Google 20% time, and I've written about this. So, and there's also 3M 5% time or something like that. Within, and I guess I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but one form of exploitation and control is a decentralized version. And the way it works is you harvest people's ideas and everything like that, but make sure that they don't get away to vote. Google 20% time is one of those. So the guy that made Gmail and the guy that made AdWords, right? Gmail is at least a $5 billion product, at least, right? He's not a billionaire, right? And he made it on 20% time. So the first iteration of 20% time was, hey, we're going to do our thing on Friday, and you guys can do whatever you want, and we like it. We're going to go ahead and use it. People got hip to it after a couple of years, and they said, I'm going to experiment, and if it's actually going to work, no, I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to leave and do my own thing, right? And so because you don't get, and this is a word that I would introduce, you have egalitarianism, people talking about fairness and all that, I would introduce the word equitability. If someone brings in an idea, they put their sweat equity, their risk, their time and all that, there's some kind of fairness that needs to be involved, and some kind of, if you want to say, hierarchy or something like that, where they get to say, some of this is mine. When so you have egalitarianism, is everyone's equal. And people are kind of hostile to that. And I think for good reason. But equitability is a thing that kind of slips under the radar, where people intuitively think of it and they believe it and all that. But the denial of equitability, I don't want to run on too much. The denial of equitability is how you exploit people within decentralization. So you can, again, bring it back to the Google 20% time. Google 20% time is a myth now. Nobody does it. But because of, and you can see about how they complain about it. You have to do your own marketing within the company to say, here's my idea. You have to do it on your own time. So there's no way to get the company to adopt your stuff without spending more than the 40 hours to get it done. And then on top of that, you don't get any of that. You can spend a bunch of time on it, and then you don't get the reward from it to incentivize you to do it. So so the incentive is to leave as soon as you figure out that's good. And then of course the company realized that and they adjust. So that's where we call it the harvestocracy. People, if you want to be evil, you want to make it to where people are involved as much as possible and they feel like they have autonomy and all of this, but you still take their stuff.
Right.
That's the new way to exploit.
And what you said is real important, which is the solution was to leave the company. If you're operating with consent, you don't leave the company. You just say, I got a paramount objection to that. Let's bring this to a screeching halt till we work it out.
So with the consent, I guess if you're defining that, if you're consent, so let's use that for, like in a real example. Let's say the Gmail guy said, hey, I made something where it's a competitor to Outlook. So this is huge and it works in the browser. So all this complaining about we'll never be able to make Office software in the browser. No, this is the first one that we actually did it. So now, it took me a long time to make this. I'm a genius, whatever. Now, I see that you guys aren't giving me a bunch of shares for it or whatever. How would that work as far as consent?
He'd say, I have an objection to that policy. Bring it into a circle meeting and say, I object to the policy and here's why. And then they got to figure it out. They got to meet that objection. They got to say, how do we do what you need? Plus, how do we do what the company needs? How do we do both? And until that gets resolved, that it ain't going forward.
So ain't going forward means
if policy stops.
Yeah. So the investors, the owners, let's just say Sergi, right? Sergi and I forget the other guy's name. They come through and they're like, nope, you did it
right
on our time.
If the owners can come through and ignore him, you don't have consent.
Okay. So the consent needs to be built into at the least the bylaws, you say, to try to make it have some power?
Yep.
Okay.
It needs to go all the way up to the board.
Yeah. Well, the board is elected by the owner. So I think it needs to be in some type of constitution.
The owners get to have a voice, if they put, financial experts in there, but everybody else gets to have a voice in that board too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So as far as electing the board, so electing the board is in the bylaws, is what you're saying.
Right. And there ought to be people who are elected from the workforce onto the board.
Right.
With their consent.
With their consent. Right. So I think it comes down to that. So the ratio of, if obviously within Google, 99.999% of the people are workers and the rest are owners, right? So I think it comes down to proportion, right?
Nope.
So
You're thinking majority vote.
yeah.
Consent is not majority vote.
Oh, is it total?
One person can say, I have a paramount objection, and that stops the process till it's resolved.
Okay. So all the workers in Google would, if anyone objects.
Nope. They elect a representative.
Okay. All right. So they elected, and
that-
so all of that is inside of the bylaws.
Right.
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
I was going to say, could you define like paramount objection? Because it sounds like it's different than objection.
Yeah. It's really hard to say in English, and it's really easy to say in Dutch. So the English is all screwed up. We have a screwed up language. So I'm going to say it in Dutch and translate it directly. If I say it in English, I'd say paramount objection is you don't have a paramount objection, or you have a paramount objection if it's reasoned and let's see, consent is no reasoned and paramount objection. That's not what it means in Dutch. Dutch is geen argumenteerd en overwegend bezwaar. What that means is there's no overweighing. There's no overweighing. Sorry, I've got to back up. No argumented, and that means like the facts of the case. You can't really say it in English. In English, it sounds like you're yelling about it, unless you're in mathematics when the equation has arguments. So it's that meaning of arguments. No argumented or observable things, and overweighing, overwegen, bezwaar. Bezwaar in Dutch means a heavy feeling. So objection means I have a heaviness. In English, objection is like all in your head. It's very intellectual. It's a French-based word, so it's got no feelings in it. All of our feelings are on the Anglo-Saxon side of the language. So it's an objection is a heavy feeling. And so an overweighing objection, overweighing bezwaar, is a very heavy, heavy feeling. So you've got the intellectual side, and then you've got the emotional side. And they both, either one is enough to make an objection. So it's a whole body vote. You can say in something, guys, I don't know why, but this just feels really bad. And so the facilitator is going to come back and say, John, where does it feel bad? I get all tense in my shoulders and my stomach feels bad. Well, what's causing that? And you try to get to what is it that's underneath it. But if I'm going around asking for consent and somebody says, no objection like this, and they're looking at their belly, I'd say that's an objection because your mouth and your body are arguing with each other. So we go back and say, what's wrong? And there's always something wrong. And usually it's stuff that nobody thought of, and you end up with a much better decision. So it's not agreement. It's you have to experience it some to see the difference. But consensus is agreement, and that's all in your head. This is acceptance. Does your body feel right? Are there facts that you can lay out there? And if there are, we want to hear it because we want to have what you're perceiving and what we're perceiving all wrapped up in the decision. It's called both and thinking. We're used to doing either or thinking. It's either this or it's that. But both and thinking says, let's put it all together.
So do they get veto power or?
Not, it's the objection is the beginning of a creative process. It's not a veto. It's like, okay, let's think together. Let's do some reflective thinking. It creates what's called a disorienting crisis. And that's the beginning of what they call transformative learning. There's a whole big long theory about that. So what you're doing is you're engaging in transformative learning when you do consent decision making. You get inevitably something new comes out. And the pressure to get a decision is the pressure to serve your customer, the pressure to get what you're trying to do together done. If we're going to get it done, we got to get this solved. And it works. Sounds weird, but it works.
Mm-hmm.
So in companies that use this, would you have rules that actually say you can't go on and overrule I'm just going to use the simple word of objections. So So you don't have consent. So then you are no one else has the authority to overrule and move forward.
Right.
Okay.
If somebody is just non-functional, they can be removed or fired or whatever, but that's pretty hard to do because you have to have a pretty good track record of being an asshole.
That sounds like other rules you'd put in place to try to help prevent it. And then as long as those don't happen, then you would be blocked. And there's no one else that has authority that could come in and push it on through.
Right. A facilitator cannot say your objection is invalid. And what happens is either you get a new insight and your framework flips, or everybody else gets it, or something in between, or something totally new comes out of it. And I've got lots of stories that way, how that works. It's a way of thinking that first came into the vocabulary in 1980 with a book called Getting to Yes by Bill Urey, which is kind of like the Bible of mediation. And it introduced the concept of both end thinking. It's new.
We like that book too. Yeah, so we're coming into the hour. We started a bit late, so another 10 minutes. Let's see, what all, questions or anything I want to hear from everyone else on the call about the book, anything as far as implementation, whatever that you want, because I feel like I've been dominating the conversation a bit too much.
You've been asking fun questions.
I'm pretty passionate about anything to do with decentralization. So let's get everybody else involved here in the next 10 minutes. I think I personally, I'm fascinated with anyone that tries to tackle any of these issues, because it seems like there's two groups that care about these issues, and one of them is kind of a pejorative. Like one side, it's like the hippies. Like they think that if you just love each other, everything just works, right? And then the other side, there are people who are trying to be rigorous, but it's kind of lonely over there. So I really enjoy anybody that attacks this issue at all, because at least within the United States, everybody's hostile to you. Everyone thinks it has to be smart person on top and dumb people below, and then that's it. And sometimes, all of our economics and everything is just kind of just based on that. So I really appreciate everything that you guys are doing with this stuff. Anybody else have anything?
I had a question about the role of analyzing like power in organizations. Like I know, John, this is something that comes up from time to time from you. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about like power analysis.
Yeah, if you're bringing in these methods, you're rewiring power, and if you're rewiring power, you got to know what the power, the closet looks like, and it's high voltage power. So you got to go in with your hard hat and your gloves, but you got to find out. Like the worst is probably family-owned businesses. You go in and they tell you some song and dance about, Charlie is the CEO, but Charlie's got a grandmother that's back there, pulling strings like a puppy, and that's actually more straightforward than a lot of stuff you see. It's like unbelievable the kind of power games people play, and you got to know that. That's what they do. You got to know what's there, and you got to know that if that case of the family-owned business, you don't deal with Charlie, you deal with grandma. Because if you don't deal with grandma, then you might not even try to do anything. And I think there's at least as many variations in organizational personality as there are human personality. I've seen some wild stuff. But if you're going to be introducing real organizational change, you've got to do real rewiring of real power. Otherwise, you are not going to succeed, and you just raise expectations and dash them. That's not fair to anybody. So I fortunately do that pretty intuitively. Love trying to teach people, but I mean, like, you can show me an organizational diagram and one funny little line will catch my eye and I'll go, I bet this is happening. And everybody goes, how did you know that? Well, you just drew it. So it's like, it's a fascinating subject and it's everywhere. I don't know that any group of people can gather without there being an informal boss. And that's reality. So you can be completely flat for a little while, and then you can be completely hierarchical. The flat's got to say how they want the hierarchy to work.
That's really insightful. Anyone else have anything? I'm kind of thinking about proposing that I think there's the book on beyond budgeting.
Yeah, the Arche Boknes, it's almost impossible Norwegian name, wrote the Bible on it. It's a great book.
Okay.
We got it referenced in the Bossa Nova book.
So that there's a bunch of references that you all had that I'm very interested in. Is there anything that you would recommend for us to review next?
Beyond budgeting is a real obvious one. Some of the stuff on Agile fluency that Diane does, I'm drawing a blank on her last name, is good stuff for Agile. If a really fundamentally important book, and one of the hardest ones to read, is by Stacy, about complexity theory. I'm not going to be able to quote the direct title out of it right off the top of my head here. I can probably find it in a second. But he does the best job of anybody I've seen in describing how you can have, without realizing it, frameworks that keep you from being really clear about your thinking, that you bring in something that brings an answer with just by the framework you're coming in with. And it's a really tough read. Oh my God, I was reading some of the pages 2 or 3 times. But it's got a lot to it. Let me see if I can grab the name of that real quick.
Is that Complexity and Management?
That's it, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that's it. If you look in the bibliography, it should be in there.
Complexity in Organizations.
Yeah, that's one. He wrote a later one. I don't know that we reference in there. That's a little bit easier to read. But it's like the complexity theory stuff is really complex. It's really fascinating. So that had an impact on me. If you've got the book there, Sandy Marmoli's book. I should have had the book here with me. Let's see if I can pull it up real quick. Does that show up in there?
Which one?
Sandy Marmoli.
Oh, Sandy Marmoli.
It's about teams.
I don't see that one.
Hang on, I'll figure it out. just opening it up here.
Is the book called Creating Great Teams?
That's it. Yeah.
Thanks, Brennan.
Yeah, we mentioned her in the book, but it doesn't look like we cite her book. Yeah, she's got a box on page 5960. That's a really easy book to read, and it's got a lot to it.
Yeah, pragmatic programmers. That's cool. Publisher.
The another thing you can do if you want to sit in on a marathon, we're doing those that are teaching like agile coaches and stuff how to do probes. We're running the second one starting late June. It was organized in India, and it's amazing how far everybody came. And when we were working with them, they came in really not knowing anything about scientific process. I couldn't believe it. It was like they hadn't absorbed 8th grade science, but they got it, and they were really doing great stuff by the end of the 4th session. You know, the officer was really excited. Wow, you're doing really neat stuff. And they were probing all kinds of stuff. And so it's a skill we're realizing that a lot of people, for whatever reason, you'd think they would have it, but they don't. And so anybody that wants to come in on that, let me know. We're, like I say, we're starting it toward the end of June. And
Definitely interested in that.
yeah, stick your email in the chat or something if you want, and I'll get to you. Utah's written some really basic, good books on different agile topics. If you want to go more in depth on sociocracy, you can read We the People by me. Retrospectives for Organizational Change, 2nd edition, is one that Utah wrote, and it's a really solid one. And we've got some other books that she's written in the back of the book. But I do recommend her retrospectives book. The stuff on transformative learning is really good. It's a whole academic area that has just been kind of like hiding from the world. I just finished helping somebody write a paper on it. I tried submitting a paper to this latest Agile conference where I was having somebody as a transformative learning expert to talk about the relationship between that and Agile transformation, but they didn't take it. Yeah, if you look on page 99, the Drago Severson is really, it's a whole world unto itself. Yeah, it's on the bibliography back there in page 210. Drago Severson.
Learning for Leadership.
Yeah. It's a really important topic.
Yeah. How is it that you get a large group of people to learn anything? We like to say, you know, like the Winston Churchill group, you know, they say, or quote, you know, Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted
All other
absolutely every
possibilities.
other. Yes. And so how is it that you push that faster, make it happen faster? And that the part of the book where you're talking about the transformative learning seems to try to address that.
If the top of an organization is respected by everybody and they'll listen to him or her, then they're most equipped to lead organizational cultural change. If you take the approach of Karen Stevenson, I think we reference her in here too. She's really fascinating. She started out her career getting a doctorate in quantum chemistry until she noticed she was up on a balcony in her laboratory one day, and she decided that she could see the people moving in the same patterns that her molecules were. So she switched her doctorate to anthropology and has done really interesting work, like advising the government on how to kill terrorist networks. And it's not by killing Osama bin Laden, but she has a methodology where she goes in and does a kind of rolling survey and looks for the hidden trust leaders. And she'll ask questions like, if you're thinking of leaving the company, who would you kind of talk about your plans with? And if people start pointing at a particular person, then she goes to that person and asks the same question. And these people are part of the power network. Only a lot of times people don't even know who the heck they are. But if you try to do organizational or cultural change and these people don't approve, forget it, they ain't gonna happen. So figuring out the hidden trust network is another thing that's good to do if you're gonna try to get big change, like, hey, everybody's gonna be doing some learning.
Well, we made it to the morbid topics, and I didn't lead that this time. So we win.
By the way, there's another book by Stacy. There's the book by Stacy that's in the book on page 219 is a bit easier to read. Tools and Techniques of Leadership and Management. Awesome. That's the one that brings in the concept of what's reflexive inquiry. It's the ultimate. It's the core of how you deal with complexity. Thinking about how you're thinking.
Great. All right. Well, it's 8:17, so we're running right about an hour, and we want to respect people's time. So thanks a bunch. We'd like to. I'm kind of personally wanting to look at the beyond budgeting, but we'll look at all of these others, and we always just reach for a book review. Sometimes we do a 3 to 5 minute video book review. I wasn't able to do it for this book this time. We did it for our last book, where it's kind of like an RSA style video. So maybe this one or the next one, I'll have time to do that and draw something up for it. They tend to be some of our more popular videos. So it's hopefully, and we kind of want to prioritize people who and topics that are what we're passionate about. So
be sure to send me the link, please.
Yeah. If we definitely. So beyond budgeting, I think I'm probably going to jump into that. What I would say, but I don't know what everyone else is going to say. So
a quick question. I thought I heard somebody say they were interested in the marathon on probes, and I asked them.
That was me. Yeah.
Okay, it was you. Okay, Watson, Volk. Okay, I see 3 Volk co-op names, but you were the one that said you're interested. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Anything where we can move forward, any type of agile, anything, or try to communicate. The probe part of the book, we didn't even really get into it, but it's a big portion of how, the way I looked at it, how you even sell moving forward in an organization, these concepts, okay, do a probe, and then you get this buy-in and everything. Like, that's really a big part or answer to the question of how you do any of this stuff.
Yeah.
So, you know, I appreciate all that stuff. So yeah, I'm definitely interested.
Great.
All right. So, I don't know, Taylor, if you have anything.
Oh, well, I think we could go on and on about this. There's a lot of great stuff. Thank you so much, John.
You're welcome. My pleasure.